Hey everyone, again this is Pastor Chuck right here in Victory Outreach, Cape Town, South Africa. We hope that you're enjoying the content that's been coming out, and if you are, please again like the video there on the bottom and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. This morning we're going to be looking at breaking structural barriers. Our first segment we talked about breaking personal barriers. Our second segment we talked about breaking cultural barriers, and here in this segment we're going to be talking about breaking structural barriers. See, a lot of times when we want to grow our ministry or grow our organization or grow our church, we a lot of times look at what we're doing on the outside, how we're promoting the ministry, maybe through the radio or maybe on TV and maybe even through a YouTube channel. And so sometimes we put so much energy and so much focus on bringing people in, but sometimes we don't put enough attention, enough focus on what are the people coming in too. And so this segment, I want to look a little bit at that sometimes it's not just what you're doing on the outside, but it's the structure that you've established on the inside. Do you have the right pieces in place? Do you have not only the right ministries or the right areas of ministry functioning, but do you also have the right leadership operating over those areas? These are some of the things that we had to take an honest assessment about as the ministry here in Cape Town, as we were looking to breaking barriers and doing our best to take the church into the future that we believe God had for us. See, when we looked to the future, again, to Victory Outreach Cape Town, and we had to ask ourselves, we're believing God for it, we're praying for it, we're fasting for it, we're pretty evangelistic. I mean, for those of you that have had an opportunity to come to South Africa, you would probably testify about the energy and the excitement that the church has when it comes to winning souls. We're very outward focused. We don't have a problem with being inner focused, but sometimes we had to really take a look at when people come and people are attracted to the church and newcomers are coming in, and are we structured to be able to not only bring them in, but keep them in? Are we structured to not only bring growth, but to facilitate growth? And a lot of that has to do with the structure that we established. See, we all know structures don't bring growth, but they do facilitate growth. Leadership brings growth. The leadership and the capacity level of the leadership will initiate the growth, but the structure that's established will facilitate and put things in place to make sure that the growth that's coming in is not only coming in, but staying in. And when we as a team, we had to really take some time. We took a whole week to separate, to pray, to fast, to really get the mind of God and the heart of God. And we started to really take a thorough look at our structure. And we started to really look at what areas of ministry actually bring growth, what areas of ministry are needed. Some of the things that were happening, they were no longer needed anymore. They were needed for a time or for a season, and there were some things that we had to let go of. They say if the ministry is dead, then bury it. So there were certain things that we had to be big enough to bury, but there were also other things that we needed to make sure that were, if the existing ones that were still bringing growth, were they being effective and giving us maximum results? So we had to thoroughly look through the ministry and not only the structure of the ministries that were established, but also the level of leadership that was overseeing those particular areas. We had to ask that tough question, were we structured for the growth that we wanted to see? And so some of the steps that we took is that, first of all, we had to identify the core ministries that had the potential to bring us maximum results. We had to identify core ministries that had the potential to give us maximum results. And of course, in a Victory Outreach setting, and for those of us that may be viewing and that you're not a part of Victory Outreach, you would have to look at your structure and what gives you maximum result. What actually brings people in? What's thriving within your organization? What's thriving within your church? And for us here in Victory Outreach Cape Town, we identified the areas that were actually bringing maximum results was our victory homes of men and women that were coming in broken, coming into our homes, and Jesus was setting them free. But secondly, the families were coming in with them. And that was bringing growth to our church. Another area, core area of ministry that was bringing growth to our church was the gang. The God's Anointed Now generation was reaching a group of people that were never on drugs. They were never in the streets. There was a whole influx of students. There was a whole influx of people that were coming in through high school ministry and through different things that were happening through the gang. And so that was another area that was bringing growth within the church. A few more areas were the life groups. The small group system was bringing growth to the church. The women's ministry was also very key to bringing growth to the church. Then we established the victory centers, where we were sending these victory centers, which are evangelistic centers that are going out into different communities and reaching people. Then another area that was very key to the growth was the music ministry, the worship. What was another key area that we identified was a growth area within our church. And then the last one was the education. What were the next steps for people? When people were coming in and they were getting saved and God was getting a hold of their life, what were the next steps? Were those next steps clear? Were we making them visible? Was it easy for people to know, okay, where do I go from this point? After I've gotten saved, I really feel God has touched me. I love the church. I love the vision. Now where do I go? What's my next step? And then also getting it all the way into the point that those that have been around for a period of time were also growing in their walk with Christ. So the educational system would take new people to their next step, but also make sure that the established people were growing in their walk with God. These were key areas that we identified. And not only did we have to identify them within our structure, but secondly, we had to make sure that we had the right leadership overseeing these areas that had been identified. And as we were looking, we had to first look at the top line of the leadership, the pastoral team, those that were functioning at the top of the structure. And we had to ask ourselves, had that identified area of ministry outgrown the leader? Was the leader still growing in their capacity to be able to handle that area of ministry? Secondly, we had to ask ourselves, the top line leader, was he still passionate about that area of ministry, or was he just going through the motions? Was he just maintaining the ministry, or was there a drive and a passion to take that ministry into the next level? Another thing we had to ask ourselves when looking at the top and looking at the leaders that were overseeing these key areas was, had their ministry grown and was new leadership being developed and established out of that? In other words, was that ministry that they were overseeing being fruitful? Were new leaders coming out of that area? Were there's new disciples coming out of that area? Or were they doing the same old, same old? Were they doing the same in this year that they were doing last year? Is there anything fresh coming into that area of ministry? And if there was nothing fresh that was taking place within that area of ministry, it could be that either the ministry had outgrown them and they had the capacity level was not strong enough to take the ministry further, or secondly, maybe they lost their passion. They were no longer excited about what they were doing. Then we had to go a little deeper into the structure and not only look at the top, but also look at the middle. The midline leadership that was operating under the pastors and under the ministry, were they also being effective in the middle of the church? Again, we're looking at not what was taking place outside. We're very evangelistic. We have done our best to be crusading. We've put a lot of resources and a lot of finances into the winning of souls. We've had new dramas. We've had concerts. We've had names. We've brought in artists. We've did all these different things. But when they were coming into the ministry, were they being facilitated? Were they being assimilated? Were they being activated into the life of the church? So we had to identify the core areas, look at the top, and now we're taking a look at the middle of the ministry. Were the leaders in the middle able to take us into the future that we believe God wanted to take us into? The first questions that we had to ask ourselves when looking at the middle is, was the person that was operating in the middle, was he a leader or was he a worker? Was she a leader or was she a worker? See, there's a difference between a person that's a leader and a person that's a worker. A worker can be a very faithful person. A worker can be a very committed person. But the way they think, they have a challenging time taking initiative and implementing new things that would actually bring growth to the ministry. They're always waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. And in the middle, when it came to leadership, we definitely needed our workers. We definitely needed our faithful, committed people, but we also needed not only workers, but we needed leaders that were not just operating at the top, but also operating in the middle of the ministry to make sure that the middle, the life groups and some of these core areas of ministry not only had top line leadership, but also had midline leadership that was being effective in the ministry. Secondly, were they involved in too many different areas of ministry to be able to focus and give results to the area that we expected them to give area? See, sometimes in the middle, at the top, we were able to single out that this is their area of ministry, this is their department, this is what they're focused on. But then in the middle, we ran into the challenge that people that were functioning in the middle would have 4 or 5 different areas of ministry that they were involved in. And so for them to give us effectiveness in one area, because their time, their energy was being spread out so thin, they would not be able to give us the results that we were shooting for. So we needed to take a look at this as pastors and as leaders of the church, and we had to start to be able to identify within the middle to be able to make the adjustments necessary. And some of the steps that we took is as we identified a person that maybe was doing too many different things so they couldn't give us the results we were shooting for, is that we had to personally begin to sit down with that individual. And what we would do is challenge the pastor that was at the top of that area to sit down with the one that was in the middle and begin to re-envision them. To begin to re-envision them and to also speak to them about their passion. What was their passion? What was the thing that drove them the most? And when they were able to identify that this area was the one that they loved the most, then we would envision them to begin to disciple their way out of the other areas so that they could focus on the area that they were most passionate about. Now, this may sound simple to some of us, but it is a lot of work. It is a lot of work when you're dealing with the personalities of a person and you're asking them to release themselves from certain areas so that they can give themselves more to a priority ministry. And what that does is it gets that person more focused. They feel more fulfilled. They don't feel so burnt out. They have a lot more energy. And secondly, it opens up opportunity for more people to come up. This was a very, very important step that we took in looking at the structure of our church. After looking thoroughly through all the areas, after looking at the top, looking at the middle, not only did we look at the top and middle, but we also identified the key areas that brought growth. Then we looked at the leadership that were leading those areas. And then we looked at the middle of those areas to make sure that we were structured for the growth that we wanted to see. And after looking at it and identifying all of these areas and thoroughly working through, the next step was to empower the people, empower the leaders that have been identified so that they could feel the freedom and the liberty to give us the results that we were shooting for. We were no longer paying attention to all of the details and all the strategies, but we were more paying attention to the results. These are the results we want to see. It is what we tell them the what, they could figure out the how. We tell them the what, they could figure out the how. They're empowered to strategize, to be creative, so to give us the results that we were shooting for. And when people feel empowered, they feel fulfilled. And this was a key element for breaking the structural barriers within our church. We had to empower the people. So let's recap real fast, is that first of all, it's not what you're doing on the outside that facilitates growth. It's the structure that you establish on the inside. And when we were looking at the structure, we did 3 things. We first identified the areas that bring growth. Secondly, we identified the leadership that was over those areas. Were they able to give us the results we were looking for? And thirdly, we looked past the top into the middle and make sure that the middle was not doing too many things, freeing them up to focus on the main thing so that they together would be able to give us the results that we're shooting for. And then lastly, after we looked at all that, we had to empower everybody to be able to move in the future that God had for us. And so remember, empowerment is so important. I've heard one person say, Craig Rochelle one of the leadership podcasts that sometimes we listen to. He says you can have control or growth, but you can't have both. You can have control or growth, but you can't have both. See, I think it's very important as leaders to grow secure enough that we're able to release and empower people under us to be able to live out their calling. Another thing that we had to do once we are able to identify the key areas of growth, look at the leadership, and another thing we had to do is allow on the calendar and allow in the busyness of a big church, we had to allow time for these ministries to actually grow and actually develop. And sometimes in a smaller church, you can expect everybody to be in everything. But in a big church, you cannot expect everybody to be everywhere. There will be multiple things that are happening at the same time, and you have to be okay with that as the leadership. Realizing that everyone was not going to be in everything at the same time. And so what we did is to not only empower, but we also had to make sure that everybody was still working towards the main thing. Empowering them to build their ministry, but their ministry also complementing, the big picture. And one way that we did it, a practical way, is that we established 3 or 4 big days every year. 3 or 4 big days every year. We call them Rise Days. The theme of our year was Rise, for everybody to rise above their personal circumstances that hold them back and be able to step into their future. And so going along with the theme, when we wanted to get all this empowered ministry that's happening focused on the main thing, we had to establish 3 or 4 big days throughout the year. And so when we did that, those were days that nothing else was planned, and every area of ministry that had been empowered would be working towards that main thing. But outside of that, outside of those dates, they were released to be able to have their own little events and own little things that were taking place so that they too can continue to grow and as a ministry. But as their ministry is growing, they're also staying focused on complementing the big picture. One other thing that I needed to just hit before we bring this thing in for a close is that in order for us to be effective, we had to ask ourselves, are we staffed with the full-time people that can give us the growth that we expect? Growing churches, growing ministries, you can only go so far with lay leadership. You can only go so far with volunteers. And we need volunteers, and never to downplay that. We want to create opportunity for volunteers to be involved. But if you want to keep growing, you have to learn to be able to financially set yourself up to afford full-time staff. And as you begin to hire full-time people coming into the ministry, that person will be able to give more attention and more energy to the particular area that you're hiring them for to give us the results that we're shooting for. See, many churches stay small because the leader or the pastor does not want to hire anybody else. See, if you want to be able to grow, you have to not only be able to share the power, but you also have to be willing to share the pie. To share the pie. You got to be able to share some of the finances and hire the people necessary so that you can get the capacity level of leaders that are able to take the ministry into the future, to be able to staff for the growth that we want to see. And these are the things that we had to put in place in order to grow. Another thing, last thing, as I close this segment, is that we had to make sure, again, that all these growing areas that we had identified, we identified what areas were bringing growth, the leadership that was over them, the middle of that leadership, then we had to empower them, but we also had to keep them focused and make sure that they didn't start building their own little kingdoms, but everybody was working towards the main thing, keeping the main thing the main thing. Empowerment without accountability makes things sloppy. And there always had to be a table of accountability. And for us here in Victory Outreach Cape Town, we have a Tuesday consistent meeting where all the ministry heads, they come back together right there at that table. And it's right there at that table that we're able to hold each other accountable and make sure that people are not getting sidetracked and building their own thing, but everybody's staying focused on building the main thing. Again, this is Pastor Chuck here in Cape Town, South Africa. Hope that you enjoyed here from Breaking Barriers. And if you liked it, you're enjoying the content, please like the video there on the bottom, and also subscribe to our Victory Outreach Cape Town YouTube channel. Again, thank you for your time, and we appreciate you. We're praying for you, and God bless you.